Today, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. Its products are in the pockets, homes, and workplaces of billions. But rewind to 97 and you'd find a very different story. A story of failure, hubris, and near total collapse. This is the untold story of how Apple went from 90 days away from bankruptcy to becoming a tech empire. It's a tale of one man's return, bold decisions that defied logic, and a gamble that would change everything. To understand how Apple almost died, we need to go back to where it all began. In 1976, two Steves, Jobs and Wozniak, started Apple Computer in a garage in Los Altos, California. Their vision was simple but revolutionary: put a computer in every home. By 1980, Apple was a sensation. The Apple II became one of the first mass-produced personal computers, generating hundreds of millions in revenue. 4 years later, the Macintosh arrived with its iconic 1984 Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. Apple wasn't just selling computers, it was selling a revolution. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Steve Jobs, the visionary co-founder, was brilliant but difficult. His management style was abrasive, his demands impossible. Engineers loved him and feared him in equal measure. In 1985, after a power struggle with CEO John Sculley, the board made a fateful decision. They forced Steve Jobs out of the company he had created. Jobs was devastated. He later called it getting fired from Apple the best thing that could have ever happened to him, but at the time, it was a crushing blow. Apple, meanwhile, seemed to thrive without him, at least initially. Throughout the late 1980s, the company expanded its product line, dominated the education market, and maintained healthy profits. But the seeds of disaster had been planted. By the early 1990s, Apple had a massive problem. They were producing dozens of confusing, overlapping products. The Macintosh Performa, the Quadra, the Centris, multiple PowerBook models. The lineup was chaotic. Even Apple employees couldn't explain the differences. Worse, Microsoft was eating Apple's lunch. Windows 95 launched in August 1995, bringing a graphical interface to IBM-compatible PCs. It wasn't as elegant as the Mac, but it was good enough. And critically, it was cheaper. PC manufacturers could license Windows and compete on price in ways Apple never could with its closed proprietary system. Apple's market share went into freefall. In 1993, they held about 9% of the personal computer market. By 1997, it had dropped to just 3%. The company that had pioneered personal computing was being left behind. Between 1985 and 97, Apple cycled through multiple CEOs, each promising a turnaround that never came. Michael Spindler took over in 1993, attempting to license the Mac operating system to other manufacturers. It was too little, too late. The company poured resources into products that flopped spectacularly. The Newton Message Pad, launched in 1993, was supposed to revolutionize mobile computing. Instead, it became a punchline, mocked for its terrible handwriting recognition. Gary Trudeau's Doonesbury comic strip famously satirized it, writing, "I am writing a test sentence being recognized as Siam fighting atomic sentry." Then came the Pippin, Apple's disastrous foray into gaming consoles. Released in 1996, it sold fewer than 42,000 units worldwide. For context, the Sony PlayStation, released around the same time, sold over 100 million units. By 1996, Apple was hemorrhaging money.
They lost $816 million that year alone. The company had gone from $1 billion in cash reserves to the edge of insolvency in just a few years. Technology magazines openly questioned whether Apple would survive the year. In February 1996, Gil Amelio became CEO. He faced an impossible task: save a company that many believed was already dead. Amelio knew Apple needed a modern operating system. Their current system, Mac OS, was built on aging architecture from the 1980s. It crashed constantly and couldn't compete with Windows or the emerging Unix-based systems. Apple considered several options. They looked at licensing BOS from former Apple executive Jean-Louis Gasset. They examined building something entirely new. But then Emilio learned about Next, the computer company Steve Jobs had founded after leaving Apple. Next had failed as a hardware company, but its operating system, Next S Step, was elegant and powerful. It was built on Unix, making it stable and modern. More importantly, it could serve as the foundation for Apple's next-generation operating system. On December 20th, 1996, Apple announced it would acquire Next for $429 million. But this acquisition came with something else, something nobody fully anticipated. Steve Jobs was coming back. Jobs returned as an advisor, but it quickly became clear he wanted more. By July 1997, Emilio was out, and Steve Jobs was named interim CEO. The founder had returned to save his dying company. But the question remained, was it too late? When Steve Jobs took control in September 1997, Apple had just 12 weeks of cash left. 3 months. That's how close the company was to shutting its doors forever. Jobs assessed the damage with brutal honesty. The product line was a mess. The company culture was demoralized. Apple had forgotten what made it special. In his first weeks back, Jobs made a series of decisions that shocked everyone. First, he slashed the product line. Apple had been selling dozens of different computer models. Jobs cut it down to four, just four, 2 laptops and 2 desktops, each in consumer and professional versions. It was radical simplification. He laid off over 3,000 employees, nearly a third of Apple's workforce. It was painful, but necessary. The company was burning cash it didn't have. Then came the move that nobody saw coming. In August 1997 at Macworld Boston, Jobs walked onto stage and made an announcement that stunned the audience. Apple was partnering with Microsoft, its longtime rival. The company that many Apple fans blame for stealing the Mac interface was investing $150 million in Apple. The crowd booed. Some people stood up and left, but Jobs understood something they didn't. Apple needed credibility. That Microsoft investment wasn't just about money. Apple still had cash for a few more months. It was about signaling to the world that Apple would survive. If Microsoft believed in Apple's future, maybe investors would too. The deal also settled long-running patent disputes and ensured Microsoft Office would continue to be developed for the Mac. For a company whose customers were largely creative professionals, losing Office would have been catastrophic. Jobs knew Apple needed to rebuild its brand. He hired the advertising agency TBWA/Chiat last day and worked with them to create one of the most iconic campaigns in advertising history. Think different. The ads featured black and white footage of revolutionary figures: Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon, Muhammad Ali, Mahatma Gandhi. The message was clear. Apple was for the rebels, the misfits, the people who saw the world differently. The campaign didn't show a single computer, but it reminded people what Apple stood for. It wasn't about megahertz or gigabytes. It was about creativity, innovation, and challenging the status quo. But Jobs knew advertising alone wouldn't save Apple. The company needed a product that would make people excited again. He assembled a team led by designer Jony Ive to create something completely different. In May 1998, Apple unveiled the iMac G3. It was unlike any computer anyone had seen. Instead of the beige boxes that dominated computing, the iMac came in translucent, colorful plastics. Bondi blue was the first color, but soon there were lime green, strawberry, grape, and tangerine versions. It was playful, approachable, and beautiful. The iMac put the internet at its core, hence the I in iMac, with built-in Ethernet and a modem. Controversially, Jobs removed the floppy drive, betting on a future where USB and the internet would make floppies obsolete. The gamble paid off. The iMac became the fastest-selling computer in Apple's history. By the end of 1998, Apple was profitable again. The company that had been 90 days from bankruptcy had pulled off one of the most remarkable turnarounds in business history. But Jobs wasn't done. Not even close. With Apple stabilized, Jobs began building the foundation for what would come next. In 2001, Apple opened its first retail stores. Experts predicted they would fail. Apple's problem is it still believes the way to grow is serving caviar in a world that seems pretty content with cheese and crackers, wrote Businessweek. The experts were wrong. Apple stores became the highest-grossing retail spaces per square foot in the world. They weren't just places to buy computers. They were temples of design where customers could experience Apple's vision. That same year, Apple launched the iPod. It wasn't the first MP3 player, but it was the best. With its iconic click wheel, seamless integration with iTunes, and the tagline, 1,000 songs in your pocket, the iPod transformed how people listened to music. In 2003, the iTunes Store launched, offering legal music downloads for 99 cents per song. Record labels were skeptical, but Jobs convinced them this was the way to fight piracy. He was right. The iTunes Store sold over 1 million songs in its first week. The iPod didn't just save Apple, it transformed the company. By 2006, iPod sales accounted for nearly half of Apple's revenue. Apple Computer Inc. had become something more than a computer company. But Jobs had an even bigger vision. In the early 2000s, he watched as cell phones began adding features. Cameras, music players, even primitive web browsing. These phones were terrible at everything they tried to do. Jobs saw an opportunity. What if Apple could create a phone that was actually good? A phone that combined an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator into one device. A phone with a real computer inside? In 2005, Jobs initiated Project Purple, Apple's top-secret effort to build a revolutionary phone. The best engineers from across Apple were pulled into the project. They worked in locked rooms, signing non-disclosure agreements, forbidden from telling even their families what they were building. The team faced enormous challenges. How do you browse the web on a tiny screen? Jobs was adamant, no physical keyboard. The BlackBerry model of tiny buttons was unacceptable. Apple would use a revolutionary multi-touch screen that could transform based on what you were doing. The development was chaotic. Features were added and removed. The team worked brutal hours, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. There were moments when even Jobs wasn't sure they could pull it off. Then came January 9th, 2007. Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at Macworld in San Francisco and said the words that would change everything. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone, and the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, an internet communicator, an iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. On June 29, 2007, the iPhone went on sale. People lined up for days outside Apple stores. In its first weekend, Apple sold 270,000 units. By the end of the first year, they had sold over 6 million. But the iPhone was more than just a successful product. It created an entirely new industry. The App Store, launched in 2008, gave developers a platform to create millions of applications. The smartphone revolution that Apple started transformed every aspect of modern life. Today, the iPhone accounts for more than half of Apple's revenue and has generated over $2 trillion in sales. The company that was 90 days from bankruptcy in 1997 became the first trillion-dollar company in 2018 and the first $3 trillion company in 2022. Apple's comeback wasn't just about one man or one product, it was about focus, about understanding what customers truly wanted before they knew they wanted it, and about the courage to make bold decisions when everyone said you were wrong. The story of Apple's near-death and resurrection is more than a business case study. It's a reminder that even the most innovative companies can lose their way, that leadership matters enormously, and that comeback is always possible with the right vision and execution. Steve Jobs passed away in October 2011, but his impact endures. He didn't just save Apple. From 90 days of cash to the most valuable company on earth, from garage startup to industry giant, from near bankruptcy to the iPhone. This is the story of how Apple almost died, and how it changed the world instead.